Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Michael David Cobb Bowen from Free Black Thought organization, and we'll be talking about what that is in a little bit. He is a Stoic writer, he's a data engineer, and he's the author of the award-winning blog Cobb. He's been published in Newsweek, and he's contributed to NPR a lot, and he also has a Substack page. Today we'll be discussing the work of his organization and how it's relevant to current grassroots movements, social trends, and social and political ideas and problems and confrontations, I would even say. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we delve into discussing, the more controversial aspects of all this, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Free Black Thought and what's it all about.
Sure. As you said, I'm Michael David Cobb Bowen. A lot of people know me as a blogger, Cobb. I've been blogging online for over 20 years. And talking about various subjects, current affairs, I got involved with the Foundation for Free Black Thought, of which I'm now vice president and a board member, a couple of years ago. And the folks who were there engaged me. I didn't seek them out, but they saw a Confederate in me, since I'm definitely a civil libertarian and interested in the quality of dialogue in general. I think, like a lot of the people who are in Free Black Thought, officers and board members who are in academia, recognize that free speech was under attack in their academic institutions. And they were facing opposition from woke, from CRT enthusiasts, and it was jeopardizing their very careers. And I remember one of the members said, my children are Black, and if things that are taught in university, it trickles down to them, I don't want that to be what they have to face, because they'll be told that they're victims and that there's nothing they can do about that. So I immediately hit it off with the folks at Free Black Thought and joined in as a founding member. Over the past couple of years, we've grown a lot. We've got over 50,000 Twitter followers. We have published a journal, and we're primarily about the defense of heterodox Black thought. And some people aren't familiar with something like a term like Black diversity. And we're saying that, about 46 million African Americans here do not all think the same. And we think that if you take a heterodox approach to the ideas that have been proposed over the years by Black artists, writers, politicians, thinkers of all sorts, that you'll get a better picture of America, a better picture of what liberty in America can mean. So it's not a story of victimhood. It's a story of triumph, and we want to keep all of those stories alive. So our actions are in support of that. Our biggest publication right now is called the Compendium of Free Black Thought, and it is an index of hundreds of citations, a bibliography, if you will, of all kinds of Black writers, poets, musicians, and their contribution to the dialogue of America. And so that's what we're all about, bringing all that to the fore as an educational nonprofit 501c3 organization.
As somebody who attended an American public school, I have to admit that the history of the US as taught on a high school or junior high school level, unless you're taking college level courses, or even actually if you're taking college level courses, does not do justice to the struggles facing Americans as a people and the founding fathers and the various personalities from all backgrounds who've contributed to making this country great. It's a lot is simplified, a lot is left out, and a lot is simply not even correctly transmitted. But I'm not entirely sure that the CRT, how CRT became the only answer to the insufficiencies and deficiencies of school curriculum. So how is it that the current narrative of education in general and of certain education concerning the Black history in the United States has become a struggle between nearly almost denialism and kind of promotion of Confederacy, of Southern Confederacy on the one hand, and CRT on the other? Neither narrative is correct.
You're right about that. I think I have a unique perspective in that for two reasons. Number one, since I, studied computer science and have been writing programs for my career, that's my profession. As a data engineer, I have certainly been witness to the change in way people get their information. And so whether those are in corporations or in universities, social media has definitely changed the way we think, and it's definitely changed the amount and content of what we use to educate ourselves, whether we're serious about our education or even just being entertained. So there's a new avenue through which more truth can be found, and so I'm all about that. Secondly, I grew up around Black leaders, and there has been a tremendous increase in Black academia over the past 20, 30 years. And I think among those, there are standout crowds who have kind of taken all the glory. And a lot of those have always been traditionally very left, if not Marxist. Certainly, most people understand that Angela Davis was a hero of the civil rights movement, but actually she was more on the Black Power movement side, and the ability to distinguish the civil rights movement from the Black Power movement is an important kind of thing. So a lot of these radical teachers, Marxist oriented or left oriented or protest oriented, did well in academia. They started in the 60s by taking over administration buildings and demanding that there be some Black faculty. They've always had certain ideas about Black liberation, and these ideas have been around. Critical race theory has been around, and it's an advance, kind of theoretical framework for thinking about Black folks. But there are other successful Black folks who did not go into academia, who went in the corporate sphere, who went into politics. And there's still a significant Black religious leaders as well. But all kinds of folks have joined into the Black middle class and Black upper middle class in America. And we tend to pay attention to those few on the left in academia. And so it's not a surprise that let's say in the context of a small liberal arts college, 4 or 5 Black professors who agree with a leftist or Marxist take on history, constitute a majority, and that's all you'll hear. And so I'll tell a little story. Somewhere back in about 1992, I went to a conference at Harvard, and this was the Black professors at Harvard having their big consortium. And there were some academic superstars there, including Lonnie Guinier, including Robin Kilson, and several others I can't remember off the top of my head. But there weren't very many in STEM. There were 1 or 2 that I met with, and I wanted to talk to them about the internet. And I basically said, if you guys have a message of liberation to America, it's not going to get to them through the university system. You'll have to use the internet, and you can communicate all you want for free. And they kind of joked and laughed that off. They said, Black people are not going to use this advanced internet, and the only way we're going to reach them is through these undergraduates. So they expected, the leadership of the next generation of Black America, which is a presumption in itself, we're going to follow in their footsteps because they had got tenure, and they were, one of the first generation to get tenure at these major universities. So there's always been a small clique or cabal, if you will, of Black academics on the left who believe that they're leading all of Black America. And it's very easy for them to convince non-Black people that they speak for all Black people. And that has continued to this day. And these are some of the same people who, first got seated in universities in the 80s and 90s, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, and led by intersectional theory like that proposed by Audre Lorde. So I'm lucky to be familiar with that and know that there's another path, and know that there are other voices that just don't dominate the universities.
Unfortunately, if you go to a typical convention of social scientists or communicators or other academic institutions, the entire theoretical field has become dominant by victimhood narratives of various sorts, not just CRT, but essentially this sort of thinking in general, and the increasingly subcategories of various groups of people have been sectarianizing, for lack of a better word, that field into increasingly smaller categories of people claiming a hierarchy of victimhood over each other.
Yes.
From what I'm hearing from attending a typical convention or conference, some of the work products arising from such gatherings is nearly incomprehensible to a normal human being. If you just listen to the language itself, it's not something that an average person outside of academia can even understand, much less relate to in any way, even if they would agree with the underlying sentiments. So how do we break down these barriers in communication and create an atmosphere where people of different backgrounds and perspectives would be welcome to the academic discourse in general, where average people could learn from academia and make it less of an ivory tower that's only accessible to, I wouldn't even call it the elites, but I would say cliques of people who decided to devote their lives to that particular pursuit and make everyone else, they've somehow become admired by everyone else and became an exclusive authority on everything, but at the same time, they've distanced themselves from regular people, regular consumers of information.
Yes, you kind of nailed it, and that's an interesting question. One thing that they have done that's strategically smart is they've tied everything to narrative. So as a computer scientist, I also loved writing for people, and I've always thought that I write for people through computers. And that makes me a gamer as well as someone in business intelligence as well. So I understand that there is an alternate way, an alternate path of getting people to think certain ways. And certainly the gaming community is not led around by that. They have a different aesthetic. They understand what is a good game and what is not. And I think all of us, even in the United States, as compared to more closed societies, are accustomed to watching TV and seeing things that may be controversial in other places. So the good news is we have many avenues that we can use to combat, the ivory tower, the academic cliques. But also, we see that this is ideologically driven. So they're not going to be satisfied until they get power. And I think we have to think of the culture wars in two ways. Number one, you have to understand that there are always people who want money, power, and votes. All right. And so when that's their bottom line, then you have to understand that they're not about education. They're not about edification. They're not about using culture to help people improve their lives. They're about using education to get their ideological points across so that gains them power and votes. So when you hear something like you're voting against your own interests, that's a key to listen to them. And we at Free Black Thought have published something on our Journal of Free Black Thought at Substack that give you clues as to ways to identify the way CRT operates, even at the K-12 level. And this is a handy guide for parents. It's extensive. There's a shorter version, but it's very extensive so that you can identify what's going wrong in your children's schools and how to counter that. And I think we've all heard by now the narratives about white privilege. And I think there's a significant enough common sense backlash against that, against theories of white supremacy dominating the world, to say, hold on a minute, that doesn't necessarily make sense. And I'm not going to have to try to rethink what Martin Luther King said or what everything that I've learned about American history up until this point, or the 1619 Project. We've had success without this new progressive illiberalism. And we can pay attention to when it becomes authoritative or authoritarian, when they're shutting down free speech on college campuses, when they're saying you can't dissent from what we're saying, and this is the only way. So there are common sense ways that we know that we're being messed with. And we understand that people are about power and not really helping us to self-actualize. All right. So whenever they put a program out there that says, this program is going to help you, or vote for me and we'll set you free, that's not helping us empower ourselves. And so those are some ways that we can see what's going wrong. Number one, the illiberal authoritarianism. All right. So they don't allow dissent. When they use this confusing postmodernist language, and then Helen Pluckrose is one of the people that we turn to say she sees through all of this stuff. And she's very generous as an academic. I'm a little bit more hard-headed. I'm ready to fight back. When we hear that there's a narrative that's supposed to help everybody when they go after money, votes, and power. So there's simple ways for us to identify this. Use your gut, use common sense, beware of these new fancy terms, and know that liberty and justice for all is what we want, not this kind of liberty and justice for these kinds of people or for this community, or any of that stuff.
Now, the history of Black writing, Black literature, and thought in the United States, there is a very strong stream of celebrating accomplishment, of facing injustice with hard work, with accomplishment, with the self-empowerment, as you called it, but for whatever reason, the academic pursuits seem to underemphasize and underplay the writers and thinkers who have pursued that particular view of the way of breaking through prejudices and injustices and various obstacles. How do you explain that this sort of discourse has been almost hijacked, and how do you reintroduce it to the students who are entering academia? Because most of the students who go to college or grad school, they're not going to necessarily be their minds are not necessarily going to be open to a diversity of thought. They're going to get whatever curriculum they get and assume that's all it is because it's been created by somebody and that somebody has authority.
Mhm.
How do you get regular students engaged with what is being underemphasized by the traditional curriculum as we see it today?
Yes. We're definitely reaching out to younger folks. We're making positive efforts to reach out to them. One I would mention is Kimmy Katiti. Kimmy is an artist and a skateboarder out here in Southern California, and she has a good channel. Everyone is familiar with Coleman Hughes, so there are young people who are resisting this top-down view, and we say it's ironic that this radical left is not of the people so much. Here's the authority. This is the project, and we are the people that you should look towards. But also, there are parents who understand and who are not going to be overridden by their school boards. They're going to take control. They're becoming more activist. California's for equal rights here in California is making progress. We're a partner with them, and we attended their seminar in San Diego over the summer, and that's going to be an annual thing. And they pay very close attention, especially to how Asian students are marginalized with the current regimes of affirmative action and race-based admission standards. And it's complex. It's not simple. We're trying to be fair as possible to everyone, but you kind of know when a powerful group is trying to take over and stuff standards down your throat. The weakness is that a lot of these academics in their departments only kind of respond to their small management staff. It could be less than a dozen people in a department, and you can get away with all kinds of crazy stuff in an organization that small. If you work in a larger company or business, you know that you can't get away with that. I'm saying basically there is a short hurdle to overcome if you are in your mid 40s or 50s talking down to people who are just 19, 20, 21, and saying, you have to get through me to get to a productive career. And that's the kind of threat that they hold over them. But they don't hold that threat over other academics, and they don't hold it over other professionals outside of this. So that's why I think it's important for people who dissent from this indoctrination get involved, because this is a question of democracy. It's a question of how are we prepared to deal with our democracy, and what happens if we are miseducated. So I think there are plenty of strands of people who can see this needs to be corrected, and what goes one way can come back the other way.
I see that there's kind of almost a a battle of ideas going on, but it's not really a battle of diverse ideas. It's a battle of, on the one hand, you have these efforts to isolate and marginalize and discredit anyone who just stands up to this kind of pseudo-elitist tyranny. Pseudo-elitist because I don't consider poorly educated people elite, no matter how much money and power they have. They may have control, but they certainly not intellectuals in any true sense of that word. They're just, you know, pseudo pretenders. But on the other hand, you have these anti-woke organizations and movements that are standing against the excesses of all of these efforts, but they don't necessarily stand for anything positive. They don't define themselves by any particular positive affirmation, which is why I was very much pleased to hear that you mentioned this, specifically the celebration of intellectual diversity. How do you work in a framework where many of the people that should be intellectual allies don't really have a clear idea of where they're going necessarily?
Well, for me, it took some doing. I am a student of Karl Popper, and Karl Popper is a philosopher who was active. I think he died in the 80s sometime, but he basically looks at the philosophy of science. So, from my personal perspective, I say, how much is this woke teaching affecting STEM? And I was once a national officer for the National Society of Black Engineers, which is a student organization. And at the time in the 80s, there were about 6,000 of us that would come to our annual conferences. And we would meet astronauts and successful people in the engineering fields. And so we were looking for a kind of objective truth in our sciences, in our engineering fields. And we understand the humility of the scientific method, which means you go ahead and put your ideas out there, but anyone can challenge those ideas, and you have to be willing to be corrected. So Karl Popper, if you read one of his books, The Myth of the Framework, or any of his major works, you can understand the philosophy of science and how that works together with an open society. So the way to think about it is you look at what has progressed over the years. We had affirmative action, which was signed into law by President Nixon in the 70s. And then we had a series of court decisions which challenged it and said, how much can you take race into consideration? And then you had companies that said, you know, what kind of manpower planning can we do? And then the regime of affirmative action gave way to a theory of multiculturalism. And multiculturalism sounded appetizing at first, but it also gave some credibility to those leftist radicals who said, our job is to represent our race. And they were saying, our race owns this culture, and now we don't integrate so much as we become a salad bowl. So they ideologically attacked the idea of a melting pot, of America as a melting pot, where you put aside your differences for common goals. Instead, they said, no, you have to represent your culture, meaning your race. And multiculturalism became harder and harder. It solidified so that people started thinking, well, maybe it's racist if I don't like Mexican food, right? Instead of pluralism, we went to multiculturalism. And pluralism says we come from all over, e pluribus unum, though many, one. We put aside our differences. And I have in my family a history of service to the country through the armed forces. So I understand, I skipped my generation, but my father's a Marine, my son a sailor in the Navy, that people would commit to a common goal, a common mission, and put race and culture aside. You put on a uniform because you're on to a task. And you're saying it's pluralism, and we come from all over to accomplish this task. But multiculturalism has grown hard and said it's not a good task unless you have a representative from each of these races. See, it's backwards. It puts the race first instead of the task. And so this is how everything is being called racist by these illiberal people. They're saying, well, if this kind of person is not in there, it must be against them, right? Instead of you work with your own strengths to contribute your unique strengths to an organization. And so we've come to the point where diversity is really a questioning of the institution or the motives of the institution or the goals of the institution if things are not identically representative across these artificial groups. And so that's how that has gone from affirmative action, which was racial discrimination for the purposes of inclusion. We can't deny that it was racial discrimination. Race was taken into account. But now it's, if race is not taken into account, the institution is wrong. And that's how they've entirely inverted this process over the past 30 years. So that's what we have to be mindful of, which is how they've changed it. So I don't use the term diversity. I use variety. Variety is not polluted into saying, well, we have to have a variety program. We have to put rules in place to ensure variety. And I don't say there are different kinds of people. I say there are different sorts of people. You can be sorted this way today and sorted that way tomorrow. And so, yes, I'm turning language against the poisoning of language, which we've seen from this ideology.
Unfortunately, one of the appeals of this other approach, the illiberal, more authoritarian approach, is that it's emotionally appealing and it's easier. It's easy to identify as a victim. It's easy to place some externally, exclusively externally, and it's very easy to not ask any questions or have to do extra reading and look at other perspectives. It's easy for anybody. Honestly, I understand why such movements spread very easily, because whoever is behind them always catches on to the fact that it's always easier to follow than to lead, and it's certainly easier to follow something that gives you promises of easy rewards for no effort than having to do the hard work of comparing different ideas and movements and asking hard questions about whether this is working and why isn't it working the way it should. So what is there a way to break through this appeal of cheap demagoguery that basically buying votes in exchange for victimhood tokens, and and how do you give the tools for people to actually do that? Because critical thinking in general is in short supply anywhere right now, whether in private schools and public education, and everything is dumbed down. Everything is almost automated, and aimed to produce a very short attention span, infotainment, kind of a substitute of emotions for logic, and just denies people the skills and the opportunities to use their minds.
Yes, you're right on target with that. My particular way is to look and try to get people to look internally. I recently wrote an essay saying the struggle is real, but the struggle is internal. It's not external. And ultimately, you kind of have to ask people, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? Do you feel that you are complete? And if you feel like that race over there has to do something for your life to be complete, then you are always going to fall for the politics that promise that. If you feel that that gender over there has to do something for your life to be complete, then you're always going to fall for the politics of gender. Okay. So my approach is to say, what do you need to be complete? And how can you do that on your own? And if you're always reaching out and you're always hungry for these little Scooby snacks that they hang above your head, you're jumping like a little dog and you're not going to be satisfied. You have to be able to hunt for your own food. You have to be self-sufficient. And you have to pay attention to your mental health to say, am I blotting out reality? Am I taking drugs because I don't believe the world is a safe place for me? And so you have to look and really look at some of the leaders of these movements and say, do they appear to be a self-satisfied, a calm person? Or are they always shouting for me to do something? All right. Do they seem to be the kind of person that I would let around my children? Does that seem like someone I should trust? And so I think we get back to the questions of self-sufficiency, first of all. And I call this first-person epistemics. All right. Do you know yourself well enough, what your strengths or weaknesses are, so that you don't lie to yourself? Okay. If you're lying to yourself, if you're trying to be something that you're not, if you're not comfortable in your own skin, or if somebody has convinced you that you shouldn't be comfortable in your own skin, then you have a problem. So I look at it three ways, and this is fairly consistent, and I think it works because these are things that you can do on your own. So you look at third person epistemics. So third person is, how do I understand the world? And I say reality is that thing that remains even when you turn your back. When you turn your back, reality is going on whether you're participating or not. All right. Now, think about it. People have said in front of us that the whole world is dying, and that is the reality of the planet. And we need your action. We need your dollars. We need your vote. We need you to concede us power, or the planet's going to come apart. And I find it amazing that people will believe that politicians can change the weather. Politicians can change the climate. Are you serious? Don't be so gullible. All right. So reality is that, you taking a shorter shower is not going to save the planet. All right. If you could do the math and understand how much water you use, that's not going to be earth shaking. All right. But you can get, a cute little Scandinavian chick to say, this is horrible, you're killing the planet. And that's an emotional appeal. And we'll always be subjective to those things. There's always stories that are going to make us cry, bring tears to our eyes. But what is the reality out there? All right. So you have to improve your third person, your third level epistemic skills so that you understand reality when you see it. The second level of epistemic is the second order epistemics are interpersonal. All right. That means when I'm talking to you, do you understand what I'm saying? When I'm listening to you, do I understand what you're saying? Can we interact with each other so that we can leave any discussion we have? I understand what she's saying. I understand her questions to me. I think she understands where I agree or disagree. And we don't do that by creating friction. We're not trying to win. All right. There are people, my friend tells me that he was in this high class neighborhood around Los Angeles, and he was riding his bicycle. And this woman steps out of her Mercedes Benz and says, oh, you're one of those people that drives a $6,000 bicycle. How can you live with yourself when there are poor homeless people in the streets? And she was driving a Mercedes, right? And so we are noticing where people are coming out of these weird places because of their ideology, because of their political beliefs, and they feel like they have to confront other people on the street. And that's crazy. That's crazy. Even Rodney King, who got beat up by police, says, can't we all just get along? It starts with, what is it about my personality that makes people distrust me? All right. And then we have to get into matters of virtues, which I'll come back to. So the second order epistemics is, can you understand me? Can I understand you? Do I make an effort so that I can be understood? Because a lot of people say, oh, well, you're white. You could never understand the Black experience. And so anytime we disagree, it's like, all right, dismissal. And you dismiss another human being and you don't even know their story. So you have to be able to exchange truth among people that you meet face to face. And that counts for online as well. And then, as I said, the first order is, don't lie to yourself. Don't deceive yourself. All right. If you're overweight, say, I'm overweight. I could use to lose some weight. I'm not as healthy as I should be. Okay, but I'm working on it. And that's honest. And if you think you're weird, yes, I'm a little bit weird. These are my weird things that I do. And I know that might not be, acceptable to some people, but it is what I am. And I don't mind it. And I think I can find friends. All right. But you have to be honest with yourself and say, I'm worth respecting. All right. Because if you can be convinced that wherever you go, you're going to be a loser, then you'll start behaving that way. And you become paranoid. So ultimately, it's about how you communicate with people, how you communicate with yourself, how you treat yourself, and how you look at the world. And those are all things that you can do on your own. And it will make you a better person. And you can live in truth. And that's the place to be. And so everything else that you engage with on the world, you say, okay, I'm doing good on my job or I'm doing poorly on my job, but that's not everything I am. I know that I'm doing well in this other stuff. I get along with the people I relate to. I think I understand how the world works. I can go camping and I don't need a supermarket because I can fix my own meals. Those kinds of things are things that you can do for yourself that are fulfilling. And it loosens you out a little bit from being a needy person in society. And then you start to realize how many emails you're getting that are trying to sell you something, how many commercials that are trying to sell you something, how many smiling people are presented to you like, you could be this person if you buy this $80,000 SUV, right? And then you start to generate a resistance because you've learned to love yourself. You've learned to love the people close to you and be honest and have trust, be trustworthy. All right. And then that's when your virtues start to show. And there's lots of virtues that we can show that we're not showing each other when we engage in these ideological battles.
So how do we shift from ideological battles to cooperation and building alliances that are based on character, on principles, on values, on common goals? One issue, for instance, that sparked a lot of controversy was the BLM movement versus the BLM organization, the Marxist group, which has tried to conflate supporting the movement versus supporting its organization, and at the end came out with a lot of people virtue signaling, putting up stickers and signs and saying, but if you ask them what are they actually doing to help somebody in need, probably most of them are not doing anything except shouting down or canceling whoever doesn't agree with them. So how to get past that and into real cooperation, building something together, building society together, building educational opportunities for people in need together, for instance?
Yeah, it's actually easier than you think, or at least the start of it is, because we just got through a pandemic. So we had to say, oh, okay, third order, there's germs out there. They're in China, they're in Italy, they're all over the world, and they're going to be here. All right. And if you couldn't see that reality, then you'd be at a disadvantage. And so we had to stay at home. And then suddenly things started opening up and everybody wanted to go out. was like the restaurants that survived. I really want to go out to dinner. I really want to get out to a concert or something where people are doing something together. So that's your natural human tendency to want to be around other people. You're just like, now, I don't have to wear the mask anymore. We here in Los Angeles had something called Cyclovia, where they shut down some streets and everybody can get on their bicycles and ride, kids to old people, skateboards, scooters, bicycles. And it was huge. They had the biggest one in years when people could get out there and do that. So it's really when the prize is you, when the prize is a better you really want to share yourself with other people, because you become more capable of dealing with stuff, because all of it's not going to affect you as emotionally. And so for BLM, there's a lot to say. So first of all, I'll try to keep it at a minimum. When it comes to race in America, everybody's attitude is kind of, don't just sit there, do something. And they don't know what the thing is to do. All right. And you have old ideas like, okay, if there's a race riot, there are political myths, a lot of political myths. And this is something I've learned from some other folks. I'm reading a book called The Machiavellians by James Burnham. And they're talking about some of these people who have looked at democracy from several different angles. And one of the scholars in this, I forget his name off the bat, but he said, behind every political myth, there's a threat of violence. Okay, so if you think about nationalism or patriotism in general, there is something that gets people together, but there is a threat of violence behind that. And certainly among Black Americans, there is a myth about Black violence or Black rage. If you don't satisfy these political demands, some town is going to burn down. Okay, and that happened in Detroit. It happened here in Southern California with the Watts riots. It happened in Baltimore over the death of a guy named Freddie. I forget his last name. I'm sorry. And certainly it happened in Minneapolis. And there are violent myths behind all kinds of political demands. And so people think when they are enacting this that their voices can be heard and heeded, or else. And it's not always the case. It's not always the case. When something happened in Ferguson, Missouri, there were some people who stayed home, and there were some people who went out on the streets. All right. There are cultural differences and class differences among Black Americans. There's a certain kind of person who wants to be in the streets protesting nonviolently, and there are certain people who just say, I'm more influential at work, or I'm more influential in my church, or I'm not going to get involved in this. This is not my business. All right. It's not the whole of African America who wants to be out there protesting violently, looting, or anything like that. All right. A lot of things have gotten done in this country by Black Americans without protest. In 1960, there were 20 million Negroes, and they were mostly poor. So if you said, what is the Negro problem? It was very well studied, very well understood in 1960. And the civil rights movement was the answer to that. But there were also Black nationalism movement, Black arts movement, Black consciousness movement, and a change from Christianity to Islam, and various sects of Islam as well. Everybody didn't go to run up to Farrakhan. And Malcolm X, the most well-known person, left the Nation of Islam and changed his religion. So there's about 46 million African Americans, and the overwhelming majority is middle class. So if you go and you do this throwback where you decide George Floyd is going to represent all Black people, and these crooked cops are going to represent all white cops, then you have a formula where the political myth is Black rage, go out into the streets, burn, baby, burn, fight the power. All right, no justice, no peace. All right, it's a violent threat behind Black politics, but that's not all of Black politics. That doesn't describe all of Black success. So BLM is kind of a meme. They're kind of a 60s meme, been there, done that. And then ultimately you have to ask in the long run, where's the progress? Where's the real progress coming from? Okay. Barack Obama, when he was president, he appropriated a lot of that. He said, I am Trayvon Martin. Okay. And he got other Democrats to make obeisance to various things. But there wasn't a Trayvon Martin riot. All right. Because another kind of politics was used in that case, so that the death of a Black man is not the end of the world. So when you get into these games of manipulating symbols for the sake of political power, then you're playing another game and you're not the boss of that game. All right. You have to be a Republican, or you have to be a Democrat, or you have to be associated with some organization that's going to get power. And then you're just playing that game. And in fact, racial identity itself is that kind of game. So my second point here is that, and I'm aligned with people in Free Black Thought and other organizations that we're affiliated with, where we're saying you are not a race. Somebody has pointed at you and said, you are that race. Okay. And then you look at your culture around you or other people who look like you, and you assume that you know everything about that culture. Okay. But in America, culture changes very quickly. All right. People who are very popular. It's funny. I just think about just an example. If you say Black culture is hip hop, there was a guy 14 years ago named Nelly, and Nelly was the king of hip hop. And he did that song, It's Getting Hot in Here, so take off all your clothes. And he's not broke, but that was his one hit. And that's not part of Black culture today. That's not hip hop today. So you look at your skin, you say, I'm dark. Okay, I'm part of Black culture. And what I know about Black culture is all that Black culture is. All right. So Free Black Thought is kind of your enemy, because we're saying, no. There's Black thought all over the place. Black thought on the right, in the center, that's Muslim, that's Christian, that's atheist. All right. That is gay, that is straight, that is from California, that's from Mississippi, that's from New Hampshire, that's from Washington State. All right. All over the place, from the Midwest. And you can't assemble all that and say, okay, this is my race, so it's racial power. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. Race is just another game of power, and you're not the boss of that. All right. So whatever BLM has done to buy their mansions, to get their people on TV, has it made you a better person? Did you need that organization over there to help you discover yourself? Did that organization help you discover yourself and help you become a better person? Did they empower you? You really do have to ask that. Did they get me a raise at the job? Did they help educate my kids? Did they cure my aunt of COVID? All right. So practically speaking about your real life, what organizations can you trust? What people can you trust? And that's what it gets down to. Who are you giving your trust to, and for what reason? for the color of your skin, that's a pretty flimsy reason. You have to think of other ways to think about yourself. And so we're saying, yes, there is a history of African American people who have said things. And as Americans, they have had influence on the way that people think over time. So let's take a historical view and let's look at the variety that there is today. And maybe what Michael Bowen is saying right now, maybe it doesn't click with you at all. Maybe if you had Jake here, then we'd have another kind of discussion. But we all have to be responsible for ourselves, for our behavior, and whether we can make this self-sufficiency work, because that's what American democracy is about. It's about the experiment of, can people be self-sufficient? Do we need a king, boss, telling everybody what to do? Because if we do, then no democracy. All right. All right. If you say we're going to elect this president and we expect him to beat up the Supreme Court and we expect him to beat up Congress, so we get our way, do or die. All right. Then it's not democracy anymore. It's not liberal anymore. It's authoritarian, and everybody will have to stand in line. And that's going to be it. There's not going to be any dissent. There's not going to be any self-actualization. There's not going to be any self-sufficiency. So if you abandon your self-sufficiency, then you abandon democracy. And we're trying to say, yeah, you may be weird and different, but your voice counts because you can be a better you, and you're in charge of that. And we want to see that better you. All right. BLM has made no demands on anybody to be better. They're just like, all of us collectively are going to get the power that we need. And they don't have successes. I haven't seen one city mayor stand up with one city police chief and said, we took BLM's advice and now our police force is better. That's what they were all about. And where's the success? There isn't that success. They just exploited another political myth about Black rage and violence in the streets.
And that brings me to another issue, which is has been touched on with respect to Latin American populations, but not so much about the African American community. You mentioned culture. You mentioned that the culture changes quickly, and you also mentioned that there's many different types and streams. The truth is, African American community is, on educational level at least, in the media and in Hollywood, is presented as a sort of monolithic structure, but the reality is people with African American roots come from different countries and different cultural traditions, and then they have different roots and different kind of historical experiences and different sorts of traditions. How do we learn about that in the midst of this attempt to create this conformist generic image of, whatever it is that we conditioned to believe about what is actually a very diverse community? Where do we get this deeper start for this tradition on the community level, and also historically understanding the politics, the history, and which have been very, very complicated? I'm no expert, but from what I've learned, it has been tremendously complicated.
It is very complicated, and we do need scholars for that. There's no substitute for scholastic discipline and real research, not just checking Wikipedia or Google, and finding out those stories. We can start with the compendium, which is good. It's about 300 printed pages long, and USF, the University of San Francisco, has duplicated our effort and made it into a little bit better source. So you can definitely go to the USF library system. I think it's called the Geller Library. And we tweeted this out last week as we discovered it. We are working to make sure that all these kinds of materials are free and open to the public. We will publish what we hear. There are people kind of that we have in line to tell these stories in the Journal of Free Black Thought. And we're working this year to get more institutional support. And so far, it's almost been universally positive. We're working with organizations like the Manhattan Institute, with the Institute for Liberal Values, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, York College in Pennsylvania. We're working with Dr. Sheena Mason, whose theory of racelessness is out there, and just more. I can't, too many to mention, but we are continuing that effort, and we are finding that we are attractive to the kind of academics who have been suppressed, who are trying to get their universities to hew to their goals of serving knowledge and open society and open inquiry and open debate, and let the facts lead to where they're supposed to lead, into instead of some foregone conclusions that are ideological. So we are getting more popular with those kinds of folks who are saying, I know there's something wrong with, and I'm afraid to speak until I get tenure. That's what we hear almost all the time. It's like, I'm on a tenure track and I just have to please these 4 people, and the university staff is, grown in a certain way. I mean, we kind of know that about universities have become less focused on the professors and more focused on the staff. And though their salaries have grown, we know football coaches make lots of money. And again, undergraduates are reporting on what they see as racial or sexual offenses. And the university is kind of under threat for a number of reasons. I can't comment on it from my personal experience, but I certainly hear people coming to us with those complaints. But that doesn't change the fact that there are real movements to open up the university, get it back to its original goals. We are associated with Heterodox Academy and with the University of Austin, which is the new one, UTX. Mm-hmm. And so we absolutely are in favor of open inquiry and intellectual discipline and what's required, the critical thinking that's required, not critical theory, but critical thinking that's required. And that means real judgment. I mean, I don't know how and when that started, where people just says, don't judge, but everybody does judge, and people should judge. We have moral agency, and so we should know the difference between right and wrong, and we should try to make the difference between right and wrong. And let's not be too too prideful to be corrected. So let's engage each other so that we always have something to learn, and it's open-ended. That's what science is, and that's what actually religion is as well. You're seeking the mind of God, which no human being could possibly ever do, but you're leaving yourself the possibility that you'll be improved in your spirit. And science is the same way. So I don't have a conflict between religion and science. The other end of that spectrum is magic and technology. Those are expressions of will. A trick, you already know what the end of the trick is. Something disappears or something appears. The magician knows how to do that. Again, the technologist knows how to do this. It's a trick. So technology is like magic. The end is already known. And so you're just trying to get somebody to say, wow, how'd you do that? And be mystified. Whereas religion forces you to self-discipline yourself. Science forces you to accept criticism. And those are open-ended. You don't know where you're going to end up. You don't know the end. It's always open. So it makes you more humble. And it makes you understand that somebody else could maybe help you learn something. So that's the way I look at it.
My biggest concern with all of this is what I have been seeing so far elsewhere which is one side is willing to talk and looks for engagement, the other side doesn't. And what happens is that one side that looks for engagement ends up starting their own things, starting their own institutions and creating this parallel track that attracts a certain number of people, but then creates its own echo chamber, and the result is deeper polarization, not greater engagement. And what's ends up happening, unfortunately, is what I've seen with the so-called right. I don't think that label really applies to anything anymore, but with certain populist groups that started out claiming independent thinking and saying exactly what you're saying, but then ended up using people as tokens for short-term political agendas and not really following through with anything that was original stated. They always bring up, for instance, Chicago ghettos as an example of how one political party betrayed the African American community. But if you ask them what have they done about it, they have no idea where to start or no real intention. They're also using it as kind of a a political substitute for real action. And quite frankly, I can understand why, because it's not an easy problem to solve. And there is entrenched mindsets and issues to overcome and lack of credibility, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is we have created a different kind of echo chamber mentality that's self-polarized and created, another form of the same type of hucksterism, instead of creating more independent thinking and more kind of more critical thinking. Simply swaying to one political side or the other does not entail critical thinking. Just it just means choosing a different team. So how do
Yes.
we avoid that from happening? We how how do you see yourself using your alliances to prevent this sort of one-sided engagement where you end up appealing to the same sorts of people and never engaging with the people who vehemently disagree with you?
That's a very tricky one. That's very hard. Um, I find that I don't have a solution for that. Um, when I look at the world, I see that we have more literate people than we've ever had. We have more middle class people than we've ever had. And there's something about that dynamic that makes me think, how are we ever going to get along together? I don't understand it. I don't understand how anybody can create a myth that's large enough to unify all of these independent thinkers. Even if they're like, I like football, no, it's soccer, no, it's football. We just watched the World Cup and we can't even decide what to call the sport. So I don't know how that's going to work out. I think ultimately we have to be stewards of the land, and there's only so much land that goes around. So what we have to look towards is our curation of what is a scarce resource. But there's something fundamental about a postmodern economy that allows us to all have our own opinions and our own truth. And as long as we live, in front of a computer or a video game, we can live that truth and experience that as life. Ultimately, we're going to go against our biology, because if you completely do the postmodern identity and you say, oh well, I feel like I'm a boy, or I feel like I'm a girl, give me the drugs to change me, then you're entering dangerous territory. So how we think has evolved with our bodies, and so we have to be very mindful about what we put into our minds and what we sustain in our minds, or else we're going to go against our actual biology. And I think that's the only thing. I don't think with all the literacy and all the narratives that there's any dominating force that can force us to agree or force us to get together. It has to be something where there's where a failure to recognize those third order epistemics will create cliques that will be self-destructive. So we have to wait for the long term to see who survives, and that's very harsh. But I don't know another way to force consensus. It only seems to happen when we are stuck with some kind of disaster, and then all the nonsense goes away. Maybe it's hardship that's going to make us think twice about thinking that we have infinite choices. So we will persist. Human beings will survive and adapt. It's kind of our weaknesses and it's our strength, you know. But how we get all the various groups to get together, I don't know. I don't know which is sustainable, and I don't know how we can force people to make a choice. I think they're just going to have to sustain themselves the best way they know how. And I think we have to be respectful of history and what history has taught us. And pizza is good. Pizza is 1,000-year-old recipe, and people will still eat pizza. It'll still be good. So the way I do it is I try to always be respectful of history and say, I could live in another time. I could playing a video game, Assassin's Creed, and I'm in the 6th century Italy, and I'm like, I could live there. I could eat the fresh fruits. I could live in this castle. So it's maybe a matter of putting yourselves in other people's shoes, and a lot of us have that capacity to do it, and we'll be accepting. But I don't know.
Well, I certainly hope that we will somewhere get there, or at least halfway, because the current course is very disturbing. But I am so glad that you're doing this work. It's very hopeful. It's really very, very positive, and I think there'll be inspiration to many different people from different backgrounds, and a great learning resource. And I'm certainly looking forward to following what you do, what you're doing much more closely. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here on the Washington Outsider Report.
Thank you, Irina, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Please stay tuned for next week. We'll be back at the usual time, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Thank you